I'm Hugo Hinsley. I've met many of you already on the boat trip last week, or on the bus trip when we visited a range of projects in London, and we'll be continuing those sorts of debates during the year. And Larry Barth here, another member of the faculty, and we'll both be today quickly trying to outline the ideas and the background to the Housing and Urbanism programme, which offers both the MA and the MArch options. There are 10 tutors within the programme, so only 2 of us here today. You'll meet the rest of them during the week. Over 30 years of evolving research and practice, we've really been trying to explore the links between spatial design and the urban process, trying to develop a critical approach to urbanism. We do that also in a multi-scalar way. We're not interested either only in housing or in particular aspects of urbanism, but trying to work across scales, across the way in which the urban fabric and the decision-making processes in cities are changing rapidly throughout the world. And we do the work on an international comparative basis, always a major international workshop outside of Europe, and always a main design workshop in London. The course is arranged in 2 sorts of clusters of work. On the left you can see a cluster of lectures, seminars, discussions, each led by one of the tutors, within which you write papers, you present seminars, and you discuss the issues. On the right you can see the other half, the other cluster. It's about 50% of the programme, which is the sequence of design studio work, and the idea is that those interrelate all the time. So material and discussions we're having through the lectures and seminars are reflected through the way in which we're trying to resolve design issues and spatial issues through the seminars, leading halfway through the year to the split between either the MA or the MArch with different outputs. The time input is exactly the same, but the output of the MA is a written dissertation, the output of the MArch is a design thesis. The themes that we've been developing, particularly in the past few years, one around the question of the urbanizing of innovation environments, a huge issue in the world today as we move increasingly into what's often known as the knowledge economy. What are the spatial implications of the knowledge economy? The second area around the whole question of irregularity and informality. As you know, many of the cities you come from, more than half of the city will be informal, illegal, and spontaneously organizing. This is a huge issue in the world today, and there are very interesting issues for urbanists within that. And a third issue around the whole question of density, intensities, the compact city model, and so on. There's a big debate across the world about what the future model and ideas around density and intensity are for cities. The programme has impacts outside of the school in terms of international conferences, design workshops, publications and so on, particularly the international design workshop that we do every year. In a sequence, we normally do 3 years embedded in one city, working directly with the elected government in the city and with local architects and with schools of architecture. I'll talk about that more later. So this is a conference and research we were doing in Taiwan on innovative regions and creative cities. A contribution we made to debates and an exhibition around sustainable urbanism a few years before. An exhibition of 3 years of our work in Mexico City. And of course in the AA, at the end of each year, there's the fantastic Projects Review exhibition, and we always participate in that in terms of trying to explain to a huge range of audience of members of the public and architects what we think is interesting and important in the field of housing and urbanism. Now Larry's going to run you through, not bit by bit, all the lecture series, but really to give you a sense of the different topics and themes in the lecture series. And then I'll come back again and pick up on the design workshop side of things and finish off by showing you examples from that. So over to Larry now.
Hello, everyone. The thing that is perhaps a little bit distinctive about housing and urbanism is the way in which we position the lectures and seminars between your practical work and your thesis. So what we're trying to do with the lectures and seminars is to have you looking both toward theory and history and also towards current trends, and at the same time to begin to link that through the lectures and seminars themselves to an understanding of the way in which you might want to think about and draw differently. So we have 8 courses. The reason why it only looks like there's 6 there is because 2 of those are running both first term and second term. So critical urbanism and shaping the modern city run first term and second term. That means that you have 4 courses each term, and out of those 4, you write for 2 of them. You're also able to write for other courses in the school if you prefer. Now, just to sort of take you through, as Hugo says, the fundamental logic of these, if you think about the problem of urbanism, it's often the case of dramatic transformation. How do people who think about design and think about the urban process begin to establish a reasoning, a design reasoning about very, very complex territories? So the previous one was in Bilbao. You all know about how much that has transformed. Here's the waterfront of Amsterdam. Now, if you look at these kinds of places, you might start to ask yourself, all right, where do you begin to draw? How do you begin to look at these things? Here's Shanghai. All of these cities have been dramatically transforming, and they change partly because the processes underlying the city's economy and social life are changing, but also because governments start to look at their territory differently. But what is true throughout is that you have to understand the nature of urban processes from the point of view of urban areas. That's one of the key things that we do, is we try to shape the way in which you understand the past of the urban process, but to link it to contemporary projects. This nondescript little piece of ground, you might notice a bit of Manhattan peeking out in the background, was the site that New York chose for their bid for the 2012 Olympics, for the Olympic Village, had they won it. London did instead. But this little bit of complex ground looks kind of like this. They wanted to build a new part of New York City on it. Now, if you look at all the infrastructure that's embedded in that, the tunnels running underneath the East River, the power plant, all of these things have got to be thought about in terms of a future for the area that usually requires that you think about the city from the point of view of fairly large plans and fairly large projects. So one of the things that interests all of us throughout the program is the way in which the very minute aspects of architecture relate to the big picture questions of the way in which cities and city regions change. And so we can see some fairly dramatic examples all over the world of places that are going through transformation that can always be architecturally reasoned. But another aspect of our course is that we do expect you to read. So Hugo mentioned earlier that one of our themes has to do with the urbanization of innovation environments. If that's one of the things that interests you, we'll be expecting that you would look and research relatively deeply into the processes that are driving our thinking about innovation economies, our thinking about the way in which creative industries are shaping new sorts of urban areas at the heart of cities like London. But we also want you to read into the depth of in the politics of cities. So both cities in the transnational world and Reason of Urbanism are courses that take you, in the case of the former, into the depth of the literature on the urban process today, what is changing in the way in which the global economy works. Reason of Urbanism links the thinking of politics to the thinking of cities over the last few centuries, but with a special focus on the way in which a kind of urban reason emerge from the transition from the 19th to the 20th century. And we want to position you to understand that well through not just through books on cities, but through books on politics. We want you to see how books on politics reflect an understanding of an urban world. Now, the courses also begin to go into the reason why certain kinds of successful plans, like this one for Hafen City in Hamburg, are well connected to the features that we're describing as being dominant aspects of 20th century thinking about cities. So Hugo's course that he teaches with a professor from Cambridge, Nick Bullock, is on shaping the 20th century city. And so they really look at the way in which a changing understanding of the role of the state in relation to the economy is a big part of how urban master plans will be changing. In my course on critical urbanism, one of the things that we're trying to do is to take you through the kind of fundamental logic of critical reasoning, particularly since the 1960s and 70s, and the way in which that fundamental logic of critical reasoning has led us to always, let's say, feel we can do better now than we did before. We always have this attitude that, you know, this is the moment that we're going to stop doing what the stupid guys did before, and now we're going to do it right. Now, one of the things that we always want to impress upon you is that same attitude will be very apparent in those who follow you. So they will look at your work and they'll say, God, they were stupid. They're really stupid. Okay, now, but one of the things that we want to do is not just look at these very large-scale plans from a distance. We want to get into the nuts and bolts of buildings, to read them from the inside out. This is OMA's Seattle Public Library, and one of the things I'll be wanting to convince you is it's not only interesting as a library, but it's interesting if we look at it as a future typological possibility that we might think of in terms of new patterns of association in the creative economy. But it also changes the way in which we might look at patterns of urban living in the center of the city. Now, we can look at this building architecturally or in design terms, but we can also see it as a series of possible strategies that will oblige us to reason across many scales. Now, to do that, we want you to also begin to pay attention to the way in which different architects draw. So Schumi draws in a way that involves a lot of labeling. We notice that he tends to be very articulate about the way in which people move through the space, and then he populates those spaces with attitudes about how they ought to be used. Now that kind of thinking has strengths and weaknesses, you know, as do other modes of drawing. So when we look at Peter Eisenman's work, we see a complete absence of that kind of labeling and a very different understanding of how space is generated. Now we'll want you to be aware of the differences in how architectural practices' understanding of the drawing practice informs the way in which you think critically. So as we look at the history of urbanism over the course of the 20th century through these courses, we'll be wanting you to be as aware of the urban process as you are aware of the means of designing those kinds of cities, the mode of drawing, the mode of spatial reasoning. Now, when we get to the 1980s, of course, Kohlhaas famously sort of cast doubt on our ability to even imagine in a positive way a future city, and began instead to think more carefully about the role of what was empty, what was unbuilt. And so famously around the same time that he was calling into question traditional practices of urbanism, began drawing master plans that were all about voids. But at the same time, I think what has happened is that we've learned a lot from the crisis that OMA went through, if I can put it that way, and many other practices, to also think in very, very innovative ways about how cities can be rethought. So present-day Vancouver would have probably been unimaginable to people there in the 1950s. When we look at this example from, this is Paris, this is La Défense, And when we look at La Défense as a forward-looking idea coming out of the 50s and into the 60s, we can see also that the city has really run into difficulties in thinking about next steps for La Défense today. And in fact, last year I was on an international panel to help rethink the future of La Défense as a part of the city. You can see it's very separated from the city here. At one time, the idea was simply to make it more attractive, to make it be, in a way, more of an allure than it already was. But now they realize they've got to think beyond the edges of the platform. Now, in all of these cases, there's a kind of very powerful thinking that emerges at any one decade for the way in which we might think about how the city ought to evolve. La Défense was exemplary for its time. Then we reject it as a way of thinking about central business districts or new sorts of business districts on the outlying areas. Similarly, when we look back at Raymond Hood's city under a single roof sorts of ideas, they were way ahead of their time in one sense, were rejected, and yet now we can see them coming back in new form. Similarly, the idea of the well-composed city. A lot of what Hugo and Nick will be talking about has to do with the way in which the state saw themselves as the guardians of a well-composed city at one time, and then begin to think very differently at other times. Hugo mentioned that we're interested in informality and irregularity. So a lot of what we will be doing in the courses, and both of George's courses, George Fiore's courses in particular, is talking about the informal, the irregular city and the ways of dealing with that today. How are we looking at that? Another issue is intensification, densification of the city. This was a plan for Utrecht, where you can see that unlike the city that was meant to be spread out and start to build on the periphery, it starts looking for ways to compress things into a dense urban center. A theme that we're going to spend a lot of time on this year is the role of housing and rethinking housing in urban strategies. This is a relatively recently built scheme in Paris. Every time I go to this particular block, this interior courtyard is well used by kids. Now, what does that mean? Is this a model for London and other places because this is successful? Try finding a parcel like this in London. Now, on the other hand, there are a number of other things in the blocks nearby that offer a very different way of thinking about the future of housing, not only for London, but for some of the areas where we worked. Last year when we worked, as Hugo was saying, in Recife, our work was with the federal, state, and local governments on the question of the future of housing, where the federal government has a huge amount of money to spend on housing. The local governments don't know how to use it. So in a sense, our role was to help bring these two levels of government together in a way that began to look at the role of housing in a strategic intervention where federal money could be used more productively when the local municipality understood their real objectives for the site in which we were intervening. Now, all of these things then imply that you should be thinking across the board from the history, the critical pattern of reasoning about cities, an awareness of current trends, an understanding of their politics, and an ability to choose a way to draw that, to communicate it well with your team and to other authorities, to be able to investigate an idea and push it forward, not because it will necessarily be beautiful in your first instance, but because, in fact, perhaps in being beautiful, you will also capture an idea about a potential for a strategic change that will be very meaningful for bringing people together in a form of agreement to see that things get accomplished. And that's what we're trying to do, is to understand how that critical mood becomes a productive way of doing urbanism. Now, I'm going to turn it back over to Hugo now, where he will talk about the design process, but all of our courses are going to be linked around bringing these themes together, and they're all different from one another, but they share this overview, but with an emphasis upon bringing design reasoning and political reasoning in the urban process together. Hugo.
So Larry's given you a very clear sense of the idea of the courses, but obviously not much detail. The details of the lecture courses are in the course handbook, and we'll be discussing that tomorrow as we meet for the first time and run through the whole agenda for the programme. Now, in the short time I've got left, I'm going to briefly take us now through the other half, as it were, of the programme. So you've got all the lectures and seminars and research and writing around urbanism and housing. But in parallel with that, you'll also be working intensively on a sequence of design workshops. I'm going to show you the output from 3 of those. The first, which happens in term 1, is around specific, quick research into London, using London as a laboratory of urban change. The second one then goes into much more focus in a particular territory of London and uses that to really research and develop design agendas. And then the third one, as we've already discussed, is the international workshop, where we just started a sequence of 3 years working in Brazil. We work in groups, we work intensively, we are continuously arguing, drawing, redrawing, discussing, presenting stuff back to each other, drawing at many different scales, drawing many different ideas, building models, assembling things. The whole idea to how do you communicate through drawing, through writing, through models, in a way that there can be an active debate and research around the topic. So the drawing is not a presentation, it's not saying this is the answer. The drawing is a process of debate, and we think that's extremely important. We typically have informal internal feedback sessions where groups present back to everybody else what they're going on, and then we have more formal sessions where we present to the public. This is in Hanoi, this is in Taipei, where we finished a major research program of 3 years' work. As in all these cases, the feedback from those sorts of discussions is not just within the academy, within the university, but as in a case like this, then becomes a roundtable discussion with the mayor, with senior politicians, with major investors in the city, to bring that work to the real question of how the city is rethinking itself. This is in Recife just a few months ago, and this is the final public debate of the intensive workshop there, which, as Larry has said, brings together the federal, the state, the city government, and the irregular residents of the informal settlement for the first time in the same room, arguing about the future of the centre of the city. Very quickly then, in this part of London, the initial design workshops, like all parts of London, it's immensely rich and complex in its understanding, from very large-scale urban fabric like this to two seconds away from that, the very small-scale urban fabric, and the complexity of stacking and mixing and typologies that layer and layer upon each other. So we develop ways of how to draw that and then to intervene in it, from the more conventional figure ground drawings through more conceptual drawings at a larger scale of the way in which different forces are acting upon and are important to the area, through investigations of concepts such as boundary and the nature of boundaries, so no longer a drawing that's about the mapping of space, but much more drawings about the concepts which might lead us to think of space differently, and how ideas of boundaries and thickening boundaries can change things. Different sorts of investigations on specific sites, taking particular questions further. We don't just draw, we're also interested in making models, but again, not models for presentation. These are models to make quickly, to investigate, to cut, to change, to research. So continually the model as a working tool, just as much as the drawing is a working tool, investigating different ways in which we might draw the problems. The main London workshop, starting in term 2, for the past few years, has been on the eastern periphery, inner periphery of London, the extraordinary territory between the sort of edge of the city of London around Old Street, stretching out towards the Olympic site, which of course has been an area of massive intervention. We're still beginning to digest the impacts of the investment of over £10 billion into the Olympic area. This is connected to the larger strategy, and we talk about how cities can actually imagine a strategy. This is from the Greater London Authority's legal document, which is the London Plan, which is the first new attempt to make a strategic spatial document for London. The previous one was in 1943 with Abercrombie. Since then, we haven't had any real attempts to rethink London, not from a minute planning structure, but from a spatial point of view. It's not perfect, but it's a step in the right direction, and we work with that. So the territory we're looking at is the eastern development. You can see there the large area of the Olympic site in pink, and below it the huge territory of the London Docklands, still redeveloping. The Isle of Dogs there. Those of you who came on the boat trip, we went round that great circuit there with Greenwich at the bottom, and we got multiple views of the extraordinary cluster of new office space at Canary Wharf, but that's only a tiny part of the huge potential redevelopment of East London, which we've been working on. Famously, of course, the clearing of the very polluted land, the restructuring that whole area to make the new Olympic Park, which is now finally open to the public again, the north part of it. But it sits within a territory of very complex physical infrastructure, very difficult to deal with, major roads, old building sites, low value but very important infrastructure and fabric for the city, which is slowly being squeezed out now by market pressure. So the big questions about how London is going to rebalance itself, and also a significant amount of low-income rental housing within the public sector, again being squeezed out by government policy and by the market, wishing to, of course, maximise the advantage of high-value properties around the Olympics. So there are great economic forces as well as political forces acting. Meanwhile, it's an extraordinary landscape. This is a huge river valley with a great waterland flowing down through the middle of London, which most Londoners don't even know exists. So we're very interested also in that very largest scale of the large plan of the valuing of the assets of a city and the rethinking of those in a more constructive way. So on the left, Old Street and the so-called Silicon Roundabout, the very intense cluster of high-tech, knowledge-based startups, stretching out to the east, and you can see the Olympic site on the east. This was the territory of our work last year. Interested also not just in single buildings or small clusters, but the idea of assemblies and neighbourhoods. We've done a lot of work around the concept of knowledge neighbourhoods, tech knowledge neighbourhoods. How do you imagine different territories of the city, not just as single buildings or small projects? So that multi-scalar work, working on the specifics of particular building proposals, but within a larger framework of large-scale urban plan. Another group in the same workshop looking at the concept of mobility and the implications of mobility infrastructure for rethinking the planning of London, particularly related to specific projects and around railway stations, and how roads can be used in a more intelligent way, the particular stacking and organising of building space around roads. Another group within that workshop looking at the concept of knowledge neighbourhood in Hackney, just north of the Olympic site, where there are all the elements that would make a really dynamic urban area, but they don't connect properly. So questions of spatial networks, questions of how you can begin to link up the different resources of an area in a more intelligent way. Again, modelling as well as drawing, but modelling in a very quick, dirty way to build up ideas and challenge ideas. From another group looking at the concept of industrial urbanity flowing right down the Lee Valley, and then different typologies that might be used, particularly looking at mixes of use. The market so far likes to separate everything out into residential or office space or commercial space, industrial space. That's no longer relevant in the knowledge economy, but the market continues to persist in very simplistic models. Again, modelling with that. I'll go quickly through this. This is a concept around the valley, and then the intensive workshop in Brazil, the beginnings of 3 years of engagement with the city of Recife in the northeast of Brazil. Like many cities in Latin America and India, the contrast between the shiny city, the city of the new rich, and the other city is a very clear contrast, and in many of these cities they come very close together. It's not like they're completely segregated, but there are complete dysfunctions between the cities. Again, working intensively in studio, in the centre of Recife, as well as working on the site. Drawing all the time, drawing the arguments, drawing the ideas, sometimes having to make very large drawings, a drawing on the floor. Using models as well to quickly, this is model made of foam, bought at the local market. The model is constructed in 24 hours as the final presentational model to explain to the local groups more explicitly what the spatial implications are of the proposals. The range of different approaches, waterways, the connectivity, the clusters, addressing the conditions of the informal housing, the water edge, the urban core. You can see now all of this work produced in 8 days of intensive 18-hour-a-day work, collaborating with Brazilian students from the university there. So it's a very high-pressure way of testing the work we've been developing during the year and feeding it back to a real audience of investors and decision makers, rather than sitting within a university and discussing it simply amongst academic groups. So you can see the range of output from that work. Coming finally to then the final presentation, where the Federal Minister for Cities is sitting in the same room as the community leader of the illegal settlements for the first time, and arguing around the students' work about how they should move forward. And they've now told us we're sending that work back now to be published there, and that will become a platform from which they can develop the next stage of real intervention within that part of the city. So I'll stop there. We've run over time. All housing and urbanism students, you can collect a program leaflet now. I'll put it on a chair here. Please collect one of those. And even if you don't get one of those, meet me in the bar at 2 o'clock tomorrow, and we'll go over to the studio and we'll get started from there. So even if you don't get a leaflet, which tells you the program for the next 3 weeks. And if you go up to Clem's office, the graduate school office on the 2nd floor, pick up one of these handbooks sometime between now and 2 o'clock tomorrow, so that again you've got a chance to look at it and we can start to discuss it tomorrow. Thank you very much.